It was the summer of 1980, and the air in the small rural village in northern England was thick with the scent of cut hay and the low hum of distant farm machinery. Life moved slowly here, unshaken by the pace of the outside world. At the far edge of the village, beyond a narrow road lined with beech trees, stood St. Cecilia's Convent, a weathered, stone-walled sanctuary that had been home to an unbroken line of nuns for over a century. Its chapel bell marked the rhythm of each day. Prayers at dawn, quiet work through the morning, evening services before the sun dipped behind the fields. Among the sisters were two women who had been fixtures in the community for years. Sister Agnes, 31, reserved but fiercely dedicated, and Sister Margaret, 27, a warm, spirited soul known for her singing voice and gentle way with children. To the villagers, their presence was as constant as the chapel's bell. On the evening of July 18th, the small congregation gathered for the last service of the day. Candles flickered against the chapel's arched walls as hymns echoed softly. When the service ended, witnesses recalled seeing Sister Agnes and Sister Margaret securing the heavy oak chapel doors. They exchanged polite goodnights with the few remaining parishioners before disappearing into the dim courtyard that led toward the convent dormitory. It was a routine sight, so ordinary that no one thought it would be the last time the two women were ever seen. By morning, an unease had settled over the convent. The other sisters noticed immediately that their beds were undisturbed, blankets smoothed, pillows untouched, and at the foot of each bed, their habits folded neatly, as though prepared for another day. Their rosaries hung in place, their shoes were lined against the wall. Nothing was missing. Not a note, not a personal item. Breakfast came and went without them, and by midday, murmurs spread through the quiet halls. It was unlike either woman to be late, let alone absent. Mother Superior Helena knocked on their doors, called their names, and searched the common rooms. There was no response. At first, the sisters tried to explain it away. Perhaps they had gone into the village early, or been called away unexpectedly for charity work. But as hours passed without any word, concern sharpened into fear. By late afternoon, Helena summoned the village constable, a man named Robert Keene, who arrived with a small notebook and a wary expression. He inspected the women's rooms, noted the absence of any sign of forced entry or struggle, and checked the chapel where they had last been seen. Everything was in order, as though nothing unusual had happened at all. Word of the disappearance spread quickly through the village. Shopkeepers, farmers, and regular parishioners whispered in hushed tones. St. Cecilia's had long been the subject of quiet speculation, its origins rooted in the late 1800s, when the church purchased the land from a wealthy family whose estate had partially burned down. Some locals claimed parts of the convent were built over old servant quarters or even older foundations, places that carried their own whispered histories. Few dared to speak openly about the stories, that there were rooms in the convent sealed decades ago, or that certain hallways echoed strangely at night. But the disappearance of two nuns without a trace brought those murmurs back to life. Constable Keene made his report and suggested a search of the surrounding grounds, but almost immediately, pressure came from higher up. The parish priest at the time, Father William Coates, urged discretion, warning that speculation breeds scandal. In a community bound tightly by faith, such words carried weight. The church officially framed the situation as a matter of concern but not alarm, and requested that villagers refrain from discussing it publicly. This quiet directive, whether intentional or not, had the effect of halting momentum before it could gather. Yet, behind closed doors, people talked. Some believed the sisters had chosen to leave, that perhaps the weight of their vows had grown too heavy, and they'd slipped away in the night to start new lives. Others, more superstitious, suggested they'd been taken, not by any earthly means, but by something older, something tied to the land itself. One farmer claimed his father had warned him never to walk the convent grounds after dark, saying the place had its own rules. By the end of the first week, there were no leads, no sightings, and no explanation. The police file on the disappearance remained thin, barely more than a timeline and a few statements from the sisters who lived with Agnes and Margaret. Keene himself privately admitted to a friend that it was the strangest case he'd seen. Two women vanishing in a place that never sleeps without a sound, without a struggle. The church held a special mass for the missing women, their names spoken in prayer as the chapel bell tolled. But when the final hymn ended, the congregation filed out in silence, as if speaking further of the matter might somehow invite more loss. In time, the absence of Sister Agnes and Sister Margaret became something unspoken, folded away like their habits had been that final night, an unfinished chapter in the village's quiet history. And though the official stance was that they had left voluntarily, those who had known them well couldn't shake the sense that something else had happened, something the stone walls of St. Cecilia's were not telling. It would be many years before anyone dared to ask those questions aloud again, and when they did, it would be because of a sound no one in the village had heard since that summer, a sound that would pull the past violently back into the present. Constable Robert Keene moved quickly in those first hours, knowing that if Agnes and Margaret hadn't left on foot, they could not have gotten far. He assembled a search party made up of a handful of local men, a few off-duty officers from the next town, and several farmers who knew every ditch and hedgerow for miles. They began with the fields surrounding the convent, their boots cutting lines through the tall grass, voices calling the sisters' names into the still air. The woods beyond were dense and quiet, broken only by the occasional snap of a branch underfoot. No sign of them, no footprints, no torn fabric caught on brambles, no signs of distress. By the second day, they pushed farther to the skeletal remains of an abandoned textile mill that had stood unused for decades. The damp, rotting floors groaned under their weight, but they found nothing, just piles of rusted machinery and the faint smell of mildew that clung to the air like an old secret. Inside the convent, the atmosphere was changing. The sisters moved about their routines with an exaggerated quiet, avoiding one another's eyes. There had been no forced entry into the building, no broken locks or open windows, and that absence of evidence began to feel heavier than any sign of violence could have. Some of the older nuns whispered that the missing women must have slipped away voluntarily, perhaps meeting someone in the night. But others, especially the younger sisters, seemed unwilling to accept that theory, and their unease was palpable. Tension spread into the village where suspicion was not in short supply. Strangers passing through were suddenly looked at with narrowed eyes. The postman swore he'd seen two unfamiliar men loitering near the train station days before the disappearance, though no one else could confirm it. The most troubling development came on the third day, when Mother Superior Helena reluctantly handed Constable Keene a small leather-bound diary belonging to Sister Margaret. She claimed it had been found in the young woman's cell, tucked between the pages of her Bible. Most of the entries were ordinary, passages of scripture copied neatly, notes about daily tasks, names of parishioners she was praying for. But toward the end, the writing shifted. There were half-finished prayers that trailed off mid-sentence, the ink pressed harder into the page as though written in haste. Interspersed were short, unsettling phrases. The sound under the floor, forbidden meetings, it must not happen again. Keene asked Helena what those words could mean, but she offered no explanation, only repeating that Margaret had been a devout and obedient sister. When Keene questioned the other nuns about the diary, he was met with a mixture of confusion, denial, and carefully chosen words. One younger nun admitted she had once heard footsteps late at night in a part of the convent that had long been locked, but she quickly retracted her statement, insisting she must have been mistaken. The search continued outside, but inside the convent there was a sense that walls were going up, not the physical kind, but the sort built from silence. By the end of the first week, the search party's momentum began to wane. Volunteers had farms to tend, jobs to return to. Without new leads, the police presence thinned, and the urgency that had filled the early days began to dissipate. Keene filed his reports and submitted the diary to the county detectives, but he quietly admitted to a colleague that he doubted anything would come of it. He had worked missing persons before, but there was something about this case, the lack of struggle, the perfectly folded habits, the way the convent seemed to absorb questions without giving anything back, that left him with the sense that they were searching for people who had not simply gone missing, but had been removed from the world in a way that defied reason. The villagers, too, began to retreat into their own explanations. Some clung to the idea that the sisters had been taken by outsiders, lured or forced into a waiting vehicle on the road beyond the trees. Others lowered their voices and muttered about matters the church would prefer to keep buried, disputes within the order, past incidents no one dared record. The whispers grew just enough to feed suspicion, but never enough to form a clear picture. And in that fog, the urgency bled away. Within 3 weeks, the official search was quietly scaled back. The constable's visits to the convent became less frequent, the search parties dissolved, and the daily rhythm of village life returned, at least on the surface. But for those who had been there in those first frantic days, the unanswered questions lingered like an echo in an empty room. The diary remained in police custody, its meaning unresolved, its final words more unsettling each time they were read. And though no one spoke it aloud, a quiet dread settled in, a feeling that whatever had taken Agnes and Margaret was not done yet, and that the walls of St. Cecilia's still held the truth. As the summer of 1980 faded into autumn, the absence of Sister Agnes and Sister Margaret settled over the village like an unwelcome shadow. The initial urgency that had driven the search was gone, replaced by the steady murmur of rumor. In the marketplace, over garden fences, and in the quiet of pub corners, people speculated in lowered voices. Some swore the sisters had simply walked away from their vows, that they had tired of the cloistered life and found a way to disappear into the world. There were whispers of a long-distance bus seen late that night, of 2 women boarding with their heads lowered. Others dismissed that entirely, convinced that what happened to the sisters had been neither voluntary nor survivable. Those voices claimed the women had been taken, by whom no one could say with certainty, but the theories ranged from the criminal to the supernatural. Inside St. Cecilia's, Mother Superior Helena maintained a steely, measured calm. She offered no public statements beyond a request for prayers and a reminder of the importance of faith in times of uncertainty. When approached by journalists, she refused interviews and, in a move that raised quiet suspicion, ordered the convent's chapel archives locked indefinitely. Those who had seen the archives before knew they contained decades of records, handwritten logs, letters, and personal effects from generations of nuns. Now, even the sisters who lived within the convent were denied access. It was as if part of their own shared history had been sealed away. Not everyone was willing to let the case fade. Among the villagers was Peter Vale, a 52-year-old local historian known for his meticulous scrapbooks and his interest in the older, less documented corners of the village's past. Peter began gathering everything he could find about the disappearance: newspaper clippings, copies of police reports he obtained through quiet favors, and handwritten accounts from those who claimed to have seen or heard something in the days surrounding the vanishing. His notes were not just the product of curiosity. He had grown up in the village, attended Mass at the convent chapel as a boy, and remembered Agnes and Margaret from their earliest days in the order. As his collection grew, Peter began to notice patterns in the testimonies and absences in the records. There were moments where official statements contradicted one another, where dates seemed off, or where witness names were omitted altogether. In his search for older references to disappearances, he pored over parish newsletters from the early 20th century, brittle pages browned at the edges. It was in one of these, from 1934, that he found the first clue of something darker: a passing mention in a church council note that 2 sisters are no longer with us. There was no elaboration, no obituary, no formal announcement. Intrigued, Peter searched deeper, cross-referencing police ledgers from that era with diocesan records. What he found was unsettling. The police had recorded 2 missing persons, women in their 20s, both listed as nuns of St. Cecilia's. No cause, no resolution, no follow-up. The diocese's own documents for that year made no mention of them at all, as if their names had been erased. The only surviving details came from an unindexed page in an old local paper, a few lines buried between advertisements and weather reports, noting that concerns have been raised over the welfare of two sisters from the convent. That was all, a fleeting acknowledgement swallowed by silence. When Peter shared this discovery with a retired priest who had once served in the village, the man hesitated before speaking. "There are things the church prefers not to remember," he said, his voice low. "Things that do not fit the narrative of holiness and safety." He did not elaborate, and Peter sensed that pushing would only cause the man to retreat entirely. Peter began to suspect that the disappearances of Agnes and Margaret were not an isolated tragedy, but part of a longer, more troubling history, one the church had managed to bury in a fog of selective memory, as he would later call it. He noted in his journal that the older members of the order seemed to carry themselves differently in the months after the sisters vanished, their interactions more formal, their movements quieter. It was as if they were guarding something, not just grief, but knowledge. The villagers' theories continued to evolve. Some suggested the sisters had been meeting secretly with outsiders, perhaps at night in the old fields behind the convent. Others insisted the land itself was cursed, pointing to the derelict hall on the far edge of the property, a building locked and abandoned for decades. A few recalled their parents warning them as children never to go near it, though no one could explain exactly why. For all his research, Peter had no hard evidence, only patterns and absences, whispers and half-forgotten stories. But his conviction grew that whatever had happened in the summer of 1980, the answer did not lie in the idea of two women walking away from their vows. It lay somewhere within the stone walls of St. Cecilia's, in rooms no one was allowed to enter, in records no one was allowed to read. And though the trail was decades old, he could not shake the feeling that this was not over, that the past had a way of resurfacing, and that someday something would force the truth back into the light. By the spring of 1981, the disappearance of sisters Agnes and Margaret had become less a daily conversation and more an unspoken memory the village carried in the background of its routines. The shops reopened to their regular hours, farmers turned their focus back to the land, and Sunday services resumed without the empty pews, drawing as much attention as they once had. Officially, the case remained open, but no new leads had surfaced in months. For most, it was easier to let the unanswered questions sink beneath the surface than to keep reopening wounds that would not heal. But not everyone could move on so easily. Eliza Traynor, the elderly woman who ran the small shop on the main road, carried the memory of that July night as if it had happened yesterday. She told anyone who would listen, though fewer were willing over time, that she had seen the two nuns walking at dusk toward the farthest edge of the convent grounds. She described them as side by side, moving quickly, their heads slightly bowed, not in conversation. What struck her most was their destination, the derelict hall. It was a squat, crumbling structure, its roof partially caved in, and its doors chained shut since the 1950s. The place had been avoided by nearly everyone in the village for as long as she could remember. Eliza swore she watched them disappear behind the hedge that lined the path to the hall, but she never saw them return. When Eliza gave her account to Constable Keene during the original investigation, he made a note of it and organized a small search of the building. The police cut through the rusted chains on the front door, their boots crunching over years of dirt and debris. Inside, they found rows of dust-covered pews stacked haphazardly against the walls, hymnals curled with moisture damage, and a lingering coldness that clung to the air. There was no sign of disturbance, no evidence that anyone had been there recently, certainly no indication that two women had entered and never come out. The side and rear entrances were nailed shut, the windows broken but unreachable without a ladder. It was possible, Keene reasoned, that Eliza had mistaken her direction or that she'd seen two other figures entirely. Still, her story nagged at him, as did the building's history. The hall had been closed abruptly in the mid-1950s after a fire-damaged part of the roof. At least, that was the official explanation. In private, some villagers whispered of strange occurrences, Objects moved from one day to the next, noises in the walls, and one incident where a visiting priest collapsed during a late-night prayer and refused to enter the hall again. None of it had ever been documented, and over the decades, the details had blurred into a mix of fact and folklore. With no evidence to pursue, the hall was locked again after the brief search, and the investigation lost its final thread. The case went dormant, a thin folder in the county archives labeled with 2 names and little else. Without the daily press coverage or fresh developments, interest waned. Newer concerns filled the village's conversations, and those who still felt the loss of the sisters learned to keep it to themselves. The years that followed were not kind to St. Cecilia's. Recruitment slowed, and as the older sisters passed away or were transferred to other convents, the once bustling halls grew quieter. The buildings aged with them, ivy crawling higher over the stone walls, paint peeling from the shutters. The derelict hall became more of a ruin than ever, its roof sagging, windows shattered, and doors warped with moisture. Children dared each other to run up and touch its crumbling steps, though most never got close. It was the sort of place that seemed to carry its own warning, a structure left standing not out of use, but out of avoidance. By the late 1990s, the disappearance of Agnes and Margaret was little more than a footnote for the newer residents who had moved to the village without knowing the full story. But for people like Eliza, the memory remained fixed, the image of 2 black-veiled figures walking into the shadows of a building no one entered. She never stopped believing that what happened to them began in that place. And though the hall now stood choked with ivy and hidden in the overgrowth, there were still nights when she would glance toward it from her shop window, wondering if, somewhere inside, the answer had been sitting there in the dark all along, waiting for someone to look again. By the summer of 2008, nearly 3 decades had passed since the disappearance of sisters Agnes and Margaret, and for most in the village, the story had retreated into the realm of quiet folklore. The convent still stood, though its community had dwindled to a handful of aging sisters, and its once tidy gardens had grown wild around the edges. It was into this fading landscape that Father Declan Moore arrived, a 44-year-old priest whose transfer to the parish was framed as routine, though those who knew him understood it was more complicated. Declan had recently endured what the diocese called a period of spiritual exhaustion, a polite phrase for the breakdown that had followed years of unrelenting pastoral work in a busy urban parish. The move to a rural posting was meant to be a reprieve, a place where the days were quieter and the demands fewer. The villagers greeted him with the sort of polite reserve they reserved for newcomers. They had seen priests arrive before, full of energy, only to fade into the background or request reassignment when the isolation set in. Declan accepted their caution without resentment. He spent his first weeks learning the rhythms of the place, morning mass in the modest parish church, visits to the few bedridden parishioners, long walks through the hedgerow-lined lanes. But he was also drawn, almost from the start, to the convent itself, with its stone walls weathered by more than a century of wind and rain. It was during one of these walks that he first noticed the hall. It sat apart from the main convent buildings, hunched behind a screen of overgrown trees, its roofline uneven against the sky. The closer he came, the more its disrepair became apparent, ivy climbing high over the walls, window frames sagging, patches of plaster fallen away to reveal the bones of the stone beneath. The door, once a heavy oak, was warped with moisture, its surface soft in places and secured by a chain that had rusted to a reddish-brown crust. Declan stood there longer than he intended, staring at it, an inexplicable pull keeping him rooted to the spot. It was as though the building was watching him as much as he was observing it. That evening, clouds gathered over the village, and a summer storm broke with sudden force. The rain came in sheets, wind rattling the shutters of the rectory where Declan now lived. He had just finished evening prayers when he heard it, faint at first, barely audible over the drumming of the rain on the roof. It was a sound that did not belong to the storm. A thin, muffled crying, like a woman's voice carried from far away, low and wavering, rising and falling in the gusts. He paused, thinking at first it might be one of the sisters caught out in the weather, but the sound had no footsteps, no urgent knocking, no call for help. It seemed contained, almost trapped. The priest's pulse quickened as he followed it through the rain, the sound growing just enough to keep him moving, but never clear enough to place with certainty. The night was heavy with the smell of wet earth and the metallic tang of rain on stone. The crying led him beyond the parish grounds, toward the convent, and then, unmistakably, toward the hall. The building loomed in the darkness, its shape rendered strange by the slanting sheets of rain. The sound seemed to seep from behind its chained door, not loud but persistent enough that he could hear it even over the wind. He stepped closer, his hand brushing against the cold, wet metal of the chain, but there was no give. He circled the structure, peering through warped shutters and broken panes, seeing nothing but blackness within. For nearly an hour, Declan searched the grounds around the hall, calling out into the wind, his voice swallowed almost instantly. There was no one. No footprints in the mud except his own, no movement in the shadows, nothing to account for the sound that had drawn him there. Gradually, the crying faded, until it was replaced once more by the low roar of the storm. By the time he returned to the rectory, his clothes were soaked through, and his thoughts were tangled in a mixture of concern and something harder to name. The next morning, in the bright calm that followed the storm, Declan walked back to the hall. In daylight, it looked less like a source of mystery and more like what it was, an abandoned building succumbing slowly to time. But the memory of the sound lingered with him, vivid enough that he could still hear its tremor in his mind. He told himself it must have been the wind through the broken windows, or water finding its way through the rotted beams. And yet, beneath that logic, a quieter conviction remained. What he had heard the night before was human. And somewhere, deep down, he knew that this was not the last time the hall would call to him. The memory of that night refused to loosen its grip on Father Declan. In the days that followed, he found his thoughts circling back to the sound outside the chained hall, turning over possibilities that never quite fit. When he began asking questions about the building, he quickly discovered that its history was a subject most people preferred to avoid. The sisters at the convent offered polite but clipped replies, saying only that the hall had been out of use for many decades and that it was unsafe to enter. Villagers who had lived there their whole lives shrugged or changed the subject, their eyes drifting away as though the conversation itself was unwelcome. Only one person seemed willing to talk. Peter Vale, now in his 70s, still kept the same modest home on the edge of the village, its front room lined with shelves of carefully organized folders. When Declan introduced himself and explained what had happened during the storm, Peter listened intently, his expression giving away neither disbelief nor surprise. Then, in a low voice, he began to recount the disappearances of 1980. The two nuns, Agnes and Margaret, who had walked out of the chapel one evening and were never seen again. He spoke of the diary found in Margaret's cell, its cryptic phrases about forbidden meetings and the sound under the floor, and of how the search for them had fizzled under quiet pressure from the church. Peter also revealed something Declan had not heard from anyone else, that this was not the first time sisters had vanished from St. Cecilia's. In the 1930s, 2 other nuns had disappeared under circumstances so similar it was unsettling. No official record of their case survived in diocesan files, but Peter had uncovered it buried in police ledgers and a single easily overlooked newspaper notice. No one had ever been charged, and no explanation had been given to the public. It was, Peter said, as if the church had chosen to erase the event rather than acknowledge it. Intrigued and unsettled, Declan suggested they search the parish archives together. In the dusty back room of the rectory, they sifted through brittle folders and bound volumes whose pages released a faint smell of mildew when turned. Hours into their search, Peter pulled from the bottom of a stack a single sheet of yellowed paper, its edges fragile enough to crumble if handled carelessly. The letter was unsigned, the handwriting tight and deliberate. It contained just one sentence: "The hall hides what the ground cannot." There was no date, no context, no indication of who had written it or why. The words were chilling in their simplicity, carrying the weight of a warning that had gone unheeded. Deeper in the archives, Declan found an 1894 floor plan of the convent grounds. The hall was clearly marked, and beneath it, outlined in faint ink, was a section labeled Lower Storage. There was no stairway drawn, only a small hatch in one corner. Cross-referencing later maps, they saw that this area was missing entirely, as if the space beneath the hall had been erased from record. There was no explanation in meeting minutes or maintenance logs about when or why it had been sealed. For Declan, the discovery shifted something. What had started as a curiosity now rooted itself in him with the persistence of an unanswered question. The hall was no longer just an abandoned building. It was part of a pattern, a point where separate threads of the village's past converged, disappearances decades apart, an erased room, a cryptic warning left behind. In the days that followed, his thoughts returned to it constantly, filling the quiet hours between Mass and parish visits. At night, his sleep grew restless. He began to dream of walking through narrow stone corridors, lit only by the dim glow of candles, the sound of soft prayers whispered in a language he couldn't place. Footsteps echoed somewhere behind. Him, never hurrying, never stopping, always following. On more than one occasion, he woke in the dark to the lingering impression that someone was standing just beyond the foot of his bed. The dreams left him unsettled, but rather than deter him, they deepened his sense that he was circling something hidden, something the village, and perhaps the church itself, had worked hard to keep buried. Declan did not yet know how he would get inside the hall or what he might find there, but he knew with certainty that the sound he had heard during the storm had not been a trick of the wind, and the more he learned, the more he began to suspect that whatever was inside had been there for far longer than anyone had dared admit. It was late October when it happened again. The evenings had grown colder, the daylight slipping away earlier each day, leaving the village wrapped in long shadows. Father Declan was alone in the chapel that night, kneeling in the front pew, the dim glow of a single candle flickering beside him. The silence was thick and steady, broken only by the faint creak of the old wooden beams in the roof. Then, without warning, the stillness fractured. Somewhere beyond the chapel walls, from a distance he couldn't measure, came the sound he thought he might never hear again, a woman's cry. This time it was not faint or uncertain. The voice was clearer, sharper, as though whoever was making it was closer, and there was no mistaking its human tone. It carried the weight of distress, drawn out in a trembling pitch that seemed to swell and then break. Declan's chest tightened. As he rose from his knees, another sound joined it, a slow, deliberate knocking. 3 taps, a pause, then 3 more, steady as a metronome. He stood frozen for a moment, his pulse thudding in his ears before following it. The wind outside cut through him as soon as he stepped into the courtyard. The cries persisted, not constant, but recurring in uneven waves, each followed by that same deliberate knocking. They pulled him toward the far end of the grounds, away from the main convent building, into the tangle of overgrowth where the abandoned hall stood. He rounded the side of the building, his shoes slipping in the damp grass, until he reached the rear wall where the ivy grew so thick it had formed a curtain over the rotting boards. The sounds were stronger here. Pressing his ear to the wood, he could make out words between the sobs, soft, rhythmic, unmistakably a voice reciting scripture. The verses were incomplete, drifting off mid-sentence, then beginning again, as though stuck in a loop. Declan's breath caught, his mind scrambled for explanations. Perhaps one of the sisters was inside, though none had keys. Perhaps someone had broken in, seeking shelter. But there was something about the cadence of the voice, the way it seemed both near and impossibly far, that made him hesitate. He stepped back, unsure whether to pull at the ivy or run, for help. Finally, he reached for his phone and called Peter Vale, his only real ally in this strange pursuit. By the time Peter arrived, the night had gone still again. The air seemed heavier, the ivy motionless despite the faint wind. Declan pressed his ear to the boards once more, but there was nothing. No crying, no knocking, no whispered prayers. Peter searched his face, reading the unease in his expression, but said nothing. They circled the building, testing the doors and peering through gaps in the wood, but all they found was darkness. As they walked back toward the rectory, Declan's mind turned over the experience again and again. If the sounds had been real, and he was certain they were, then someone or something was inside that building. If they were not, then the only other explanation was that he was imagining them, and that possibility troubled him more than he cared to admit. His faith told him that some mysteries were not meant to be solved, that some places were best left undisturbed. Yet, a deeper, more human instinct urged him to push forward, to tear away the chains and uncover whatever lay hidden within those walls. That night, as he lay awake staring at the ceiling, the memory of the scripture-laced whispers stayed with him. He could recall the exact tone, the way the voice caught in the middle of certain words. It was the same rhythm he had heard in the recordings of Mass read decades ago by the nuns of St. Cecilia's, the same pattern he'd once heard in a scratchy archive tape from 1979, in which Sister Agnes read aloud from the Book of Psalms. He didn't tell Peter this, not yet, but the thought lodged deep, feeding the quiet certainty that he was not chasing an illusion. Something, or someone, was waiting in that hall, and the only way to silence the questions was to go inside. Declan's resolve had been building for weeks, each unanswered sound from the hall tightening something inside him until the choice no longer felt like a choice at all. By early November, the leaves lay sodden on the ground, and the village was settling into the long, dark stretch before winter. Declan spent 2 days turning the matter over in his mind before he finally walked into the hardware store in the next town and bought a set of heavy bolt cutters. The purchase felt like a point of no return. He kept them wrapped in an old towel in the back of the rectory, saying nothing to anyone until he appeared at Peter Vale's door one Friday evening. Peter hesitated. The man had chased the convent's shadows for most of his adult life, but his research had been one thing. Physically breaking into church property was another. Declan told him about the second night of crying, about the scripture whispered in a voice that matched Sister Agnes's cadence from decades-old recordings. He did not plead, but there was a determination in his tone that Peter recognized. Against his better judgment, Peter agreed, though he warned that whatever they found might be something they wished they could forget. They chose a night without moonlight, when the air was damp and the wind moved just enough to cover the noise they would make. The hall loomed ahead as they approached, its silhouette hulking and uneven in the dark. The rusted chain on the front door was as thick as Declan's thumb. He set the jaws of the bolt cutters around it and pressed down hard, the metal groaning before it finally snapped. The sound seemed to carry farther than it should have, but the night remained still. They pushed the warped door open, and a rush of cold air met them, carrying with it the dry, stale scent of a place long untouched. Their flashlight beams swept over the interior. Dust lay so thick it muted their footsteps. Wooden pews, some broken, were stacked haphazardly along the walls. Hymnals, their covers curled and pages yellowed, were piled in damp corners. Cobwebs laced the beams above, and the plaster on the far wall was cracked in jagged lines. It was a room abandoned not just to time, but to neglect, a place the world had turned its back on. Declan's eyes roamed until they settled on the far corner, where the floorboards looked newer, less worn. Beneath a layer of warped planks lay the outline of a trap door, its edges just visible under decades of grime. They knelt beside it, testing the boards. They were nailed down, the heads rusted deep into the wood. Declan worked the crowbar he had brought into the seams, prying at one board, then another. Each gave way with a splintering crack, releasing a musty breath of air that smelled faintly of mildew and something sharper, metallic, like old iron or dried blood. Peter's face tightened, but he said nothing, only held the flashlight steady as Declan cleared the last board and exposed the trapdoor beneath. Its hinges were stiff, the wood swollen from years of damp, but after a few heavy pulls, it lifted with a reluctant groan. A draft rose from below, carrying a deeper cold than the air above. The beam of the flashlight revealed a narrow set of stone steps disappearing into darkness. Water glistened on some of the steps, and the sound of slow, irregular dripping echoed faintly upward. Declan glanced at Peter, then began his descent, the flashlight shaking slightly in his grip. The walls closed in quickly, the air heavy and damp, the smell of mildew more pronounced. The steps ended in a low, rectangular chamber. The first thing they noticed were the robes. Faded black habits hung neatly from wooden pegs along one wall, their fabric stiff with age, each paired with a rosary still looped neatly over the hook. Below them, wooden clogs were lined in pairs, some coated in a thin layer of silt from the damp floor. The beam of light swept farther, catching the warped frames of rusted cots pushed against the stone. Iron rings, corroded and pitted, protruded from the walls at regular intervals. Water pooled across the uneven floor, its surface reflecting the flashlight in scattered fragments. In one corner, a stack of wooden crates slumped against the wall, their lids bowed inward from rot. Declan stepped carefully through the water toward them, his boots sending small ripples across the surface. The metallic smell was stronger here. He brushed away a film of dust and lifted one lid. Inside, cloth lay folded, habits again, but beneath them, smaller personal items, a worn, leather-bound prayer book, a wooden cross with a missing arm, and a silver brooch engraved with the initials M.A. Declan didn't have to say it aloud for Peter to know. Margaret Agnes. Peter's hand tightened on the flashlight as they moved to the next crate. This one held more belongings. A rosary, a set of spectacles, a handful of letters so faded their ink was barely visible. They exchanged a glance, the same unspoken thought between them. These were not simply storage crates. These were the possessions of people who had been here, whose lives had been interrupted in this place. Declan swept the beam across the far wall and stopped. One section of stone looked different, smoother, newer, as though it had been repaired or replaced long after the rest of the chamber was built. He took a step toward it, but the water shifted underfoot, and a deep creak echoed through the room. A drop of water fell from somewhere above, landing on his shoulder. Another landed on Peter's head. Then another. They looked up at the low ceiling, where hairline cracks were beginning to weep steady streams into the room. The water at their feet was rising. Peter's voice was tight when he said they needed to leave. Declan hesitated, his gaze fixed on that newer patch of wall, but the sound of the water quickening decided it for him. They backed toward the steps, the beam of the flashlight glancing one last time over the habits on the wall, the rusted rings, the crates of belongings. As they emerged into the cold night air, the rush of fresh oxygen felt startling, and for a moment neither man spoke. Declan secured the trapdoor behind them, but as he did, he caught the faintest echo from below, not the sound of dripping water this time, but something softer, a tone just at the edge of hearing. It was gone almost before he could register it, leaving him unsure whether it had been real or imagined. Either way, the seal had been broken now, and whatever was down there was no longer content to stay silent. The stone steps ended in a space so low that Declan had to stoop to keep from striking his head. His flashlight beam cut through the stale darkness, revealing a chamber no larger than the parish office above ground, but with air that felt heavier, colder. The walls were rough stone, damp in places, streaked with dark lines where moisture had seeped for years. The smell was an oppressive blend of mildew, stagnant water, and something faintly metallic that clung to the back of the throat. Against one wall, 6 rusted cots stood in a row, their thin iron frames bowed inward, the canvas straps beneath them long since rotted away. At the foot of each cot was a heavy iron ring fixed into the stone floor, the corrosion so deep that the metal looked almost fused to the ground. Declan's eyes moved over the room slowly, the cone of light revealing more details as he stepped forward. The water pooled unevenly across the floor, no deeper than his ankles, but icy enough that it bit through his boots. The silence here was absolute. Even their footsteps sounded muted, swallowed by the room. In the center of the chamber, 2 large wooden trunks sat side by side. Their lids were warped and sagging, the grain of the wood darkened from years of damp. Declan knelt by the first and ran his hand along its edge, feeling the soft give of rotted timber. With a careful pull, the lid gave way, the hinges letting out a low groan that echoed in the confined space. Inside, the contents were arranged with an unsettling precision. Folded neatly at the top were 2 black habits, the cloth brittle to the touch, as if it would disintegrate if handled roughly. Beneath them lay rosaries, the beads dulled but intact, their crucifixes tarnished almost black. Declan lifted one carefully, the chain cold and slightly sticky with age. Underneath the habits were smaller personal items, a plain silver ring, a small leather-bound prayer book with its pages fused together by moisture, and a pressed flower that had lost all color, sealed between two scraps of parchment. The arrangement was too deliberate to be discarded storage. These were possessions someone had taken the time to preserve. Peter's flashlight beam shifted to the second trunk. When they pried it open, the contents mirrored the first in their orderliness, but the items themselves were different. A rosary with an ivory cross, a pair of reading spectacles with one cracked lens, and a small tin of dried lavender buds. Near the bottom, wrapped in oilcloth, was a framed photograph of two young women in full habit, standing in the convent garden. Declan recognized their faces instantly from the grainy newspaper images he had seen in Peter's files, Sisters Agnes and Margaret. There was no mistaking them. The sight struck him harder than he expected. These were not just names in an old case file anymore, but tangible evidence of lives once lived. No bodies, no bones, only belongings, arranged as though their owners had stepped away mid-life and never returned. Declan and Peter exchanged a glance, the weight of the find settling between them. This room had been hidden for decades, and yet here were the possessions of two women who had been the subject of an unsolved disappearance, untouched, undisturbed, beneath the building all along. The question was no longer whether the hall had been connected to their fate, but why their remains were absent. Declan's attention was drawn to the far wall. Even in the dim light, one section stood out, smoother, cleaner, the mortar a slightly different color. The stonework here was uniform and recent compared to the rough, weathered blocks surrounding it. It was as if someone had patched or sealed a section deliberately, hiding whatever had once been behind it. He stepped closer, running his hand along the surface, feeling the faint grit of mortar under his fingers. There was no obvious opening or seam, but the newer stone seemed to hum with possibility, as if it held the answer to every question that had brought him here. Before he could examine it further, a sound drew his attention, the faintest trickle, followed by another. Peter's beam swung to the ceiling, where thin threads of water had begun seeping through hairline cracks in the stone above. In seconds, the trickle became a steady flow, dripping into the water at their feet with a rhythmic patter. The level began to rise quickly, the icy water swirling as it found the lowest points of the floor. Declan's first thought was that something in the structure above had shifted when they pried open the trap door. Whatever the cause, it was enough to make the room feel smaller, the air thicker. Peter's voice was tight, urging that they leave before the steps became submerged. Declan hesitated, torn between retreat and the gnawing pull of the sealed wall. He imagined what might be behind it, a storage room, a crypt, perhaps even the remains of the women whose belongings lay only feet away. But the water was climbing, lapping now at the lower edges of the trunks. The cold was seeping up his legs, dulling the feeling in his feet. Peter had already started for the stairs, his flashlight beam bouncing off the walls. Declan gave the wall one last look, committing every detail to memory before turning to follow. They ascended quickly, the steps slick underfoot. As Declan pushed the trapdoor closed above them, he caught one last sound from below, a single, muted splash, followed by silence. Whether it was the trunks shifting in the rising water or something else entirely, he could not tell. Standing in the abandoned hall, their breath coming in short bursts, both men knew they had found a part of the truth. But the most important part, what had been hidden behind that wall, was still sealed away, waiting. And if the water didn't destroy it, someone had made sure it would remain that way for a reason. The rain had not stopped all day, a steady, unbroken curtain that turned the cobbled streets slick and dark by nightfall. Father Declan lay awake in his parish quarters, staring at the faint cracks in the plaster above his bed, his mind replaying the images from the night before, the rusted cots, the iron rings in the stone floor, the neatly folded habits that should have been worn on the backs of living women. He could still feel the chill of that water rising around his boots and hear the hollow groan of the trunks as they shifted under its weight. Sleep, when it finally came, was shallow and uneasy. Sometime past midnight, a sound threaded its way into the half-formed edges of a dream, soft at first, almost indistinguishable from the wind pressing against the old windows. Then it came again, sharper, unmistakable, weeping. The same broken, breathless weeping he had heard outside the hall that first stormy night, but closer now and unbound by the walls of that abandoned building. His eyes snapped open. The sound was inside. Declan sat up, his breath caught in his chest, straining to listen. The crying was faint, somewhere out in the corridor, the tone jagged and human, the kind of grief that rolls in waves. He swung his legs to the floor, the boards creaking under his weight, and stepped toward the door. For a moment he hesitated, hand on the handle, uncertain whether opening it would end the sound or bring it closer. Then, with a slow pull, the latch gave. The corridor beyond was empty, dimly lit by a single bulb that cast long shadows along the worn carpet. The weeping did not stop. It seemed to retreat slightly, growing fainter, drawing him down the hallway toward the narrow staircase that led outside. Declan followed, each step landing with deliberate care, his bare feet silent against the boards. When he reached the door at the end of the corridor, the sound was already beyond it, out in the wet night. He stepped into the rain, the cold biting instantly through his thin shirt. The village lay quiet, the windows of its houses dark and shuttered. The weeping drifted toward the convent grounds, weaving between the gusts of wind. It was not frantic, but steady, like someone carrying sorrow rather than fear. Declan moved across the courtyard, his breath coming in quick bursts, following the sound toward the silhouette he knew too well. The hall stood against the dark, its ivy-shrouded walls slick with rain. The chain they had broken was back in place, a new lock glinting faintly in the beam of the security light. The crying came from within, not muffled this time, but so clear it was as if the walls were breathing it out. Declan stood at the threshold, rain pooling around his ankles, every part of him urging to go inside. But the lock was firm and the windows barred from within. The sound did not rise or fall. It was constant, unchanging, as if time inside the hall did not move at the same pace as the world outside. He stayed there for what might have been minutes or hours until, without warning, the weeping stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than the sound itself, a silence that seemed to press against him, daring him to break it. He stepped back, feeling the pull of the place, even as his body urged him away. By the time he returned to his quarters, his clothes clung to him like a second skin, and his teeth were chattering from more than the cold. He knew sleep would not come again that night. In the morning, Declan called the local authorities. He expected disbelief, perhaps even quiet dismissal, but to his surprise, they came. 2 uniformed officers walked the perimeter of the hall, testing the doors, shining flashlights through the gaps in the shutters. After less than an hour, they called it off. One of them told him the building was unsafe, that the floorboards were rotting through in places, that water damage had weakened the structure beyond repair. It was not a place, he was told, for anyone to be spending time, especially not in the middle of the night. Their report, filed later that day, listed no evidence of persons present and unsafe structural conditions as the only conclusions. The hall was sealed again that afternoon, this time with heavier chains and a notice from the diocese affixed to the door. The letter was short and formal, all entry prohibited, site pending review for possible demolition. At the bottom, a handwritten line in the bishop's careful script instructed Declan to refrain from discussing recent events with parishioners or the press. The language was polite, but the message was absolute. Peter was furious when he heard, though Declan's own reaction was quieter. He had seen enough in the chamber below to know that sealing the hall again would not erase what it held. The items belonging to Agnes and Margaret were still down there, preserved in the damp silence, and the sealed wall remained untouched. He thought often of what might be behind it, of what the rising water had hidden from him. But the lock on the door and the warning from the diocese made it clear. If he was going to go back, he would be doing so alone, and against the weight of an institution determined to keep it closed. Weeks passed. The winter deepened. Declan went about his duties, hearing confessions, delivering sermons, visiting the sick. Outwardly, nothing in his demeanor betrayed the fact that he was carrying the memory of the hall like a stone in his pocket. But at night, in the quiet hours when the village slept, the sound returned. Sometimes faint, sometimes startlingly near, the weeping would seep into the corners of his room, as if the walls themselves had learned the voice. He stopped telling Peter after the third time. There was nothing his friend could do but share in the weight of it. Declan began to wonder if the sound would ever stop, or if it was no longer tied to the hall at all. Perhaps it had followed him out, clinging like the damp air of that underground chamber. Sometimes, in the half-light of early morning, he thought he heard other sounds buried inside it, the faint scrape of wood on stone, the echo of whispered words he could not quite make out. He never told the sisters. He knew their lives had been built on silence, on keeping certain things unspoken, and perhaps that was the only way they knew to survive. No remains of Agnes or Margaret have ever been found. Their names are still listed in the police archive as missing, presumed, dead. Their file is thin now as it was the year they vanished. The photographs from the convent garden remain the only undisputed proof they ever lived there. And yet, Declan cannot let go of the certainty that the answer lies in that hall. Beneath it, behind that sealed wall, in the place where the air turned colder and the water began to rise. He has never returned. Whether it is restraint or fear that keeps him away, he could not say. What he does know is that on certain nights, when the wind falls still and the rain hasn't yet begun, he will hear it again. Soft, measured, almost patient. The crying of a woman who has been waiting for nearly 3 decades, and perhaps longer, for someone to finally listen. And when he hears it, he does not pray. He listens, because somewhere inside that voice is the truth, and until it is spoken, the hall will never be silent.